And okay, and we're live. Um,
Christ is risen.
Truly is risen. Benedicite.
Benedicite.
All right, so we're here. It's the Orthodox Apologetics channel, first show in probably, I guess it's been a month. Someone said so. We've been busy, and that's fine. We're trying to catch up. We're basically following up on the episode we had done where we kind of did that. We finished the 3-part, I guess that we could call it the Hildebrand trilogy. Only because of the fact that we wanted to establish a lot of the historical sources that kind of establish how Roman Catholicism was ultimately invented. It was not something that was developed; it was created. And so, of course, we're here. It's Deacon Joseph Swaden. Yep. And so we'll get started. Now, we titled this. We titled this basically with we were discussing how to title this particular episode, and so we went with the People versus Hildebrand because Vladika, you found this text, and if you could just give a little background on it before we get into it, that would be great.
Well, it's generally ascribed to Peter Crassus, who was around the 1070s, 1080s. He was a well-known lawyer in Roman law, which included both canon and quote-unquote secular law.
Something's happening with your mic, Vladika.
Pardon me?
Oh, there. Okay, I can hear you somewhat, yeah.
It's a text composed by Peter Crassus, who was an 11th century Roman lawyer, and it was a part of a larger work called the Defensio Henrici Regis, or the defense of King Henry. That's Henry IV. And its main purpose is to demonstrate the illegitimacy of Hildebrand and his so-called reforms, and to reassert the older traditional view contra the new emergence of Ultramontanism, the Dictatus Papae, the attempt of the papacy, of the so-called Hildebrandian papacy, to claim temporal and spiritual power over clergy and laity. So I don't know much more to say about it. We don't know a whole lot about Peter Crassus. We do know he was a lawyer in that period, and he had some sort of a law school, and he was a defender. Now, most of northern Italy, by the way, was anti-Hildebrandian, especially around Ravenna and Milan. Although the Hildebrandians seized Milan at one point, although almost all the bishoprics around it never recognized the Hildebrandian anti-bishop in Milan. But this is a Peter Crassus' work. Know much.
Okay, well, I think it's worth noting that first off, one thing that we have tried to establish throughout the entire 3-part series, and something we're going to establish again, and this I think demonstrates it further, is that this is not a case of two popes who are arguing over having the same authority. They're actually arguing over the very nature of the papacy itself in the West. So this is not something. It's not something like Clement III did not claim the powers that Hildebrand claimed. And this is why we always go back to the Dictatus Papae, because these were new powers being claimed. And so this is something that if we take the Dictatus Papae out of it and the actions that were taken by Hildebrand in defense of his ideas, we have an image of the papacy that is very, very different from the one that developed afterwards. So they're completely different concepts, and this is very important because this is a position that that Peter Crassus is taking here, is that basically Hildebrand's position is innovative and dangerous, not just innovative, but also wrong, dangerous, and so on and so forth.
Remember, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. No, go ahead, Vladika.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I was just confirming. No. You're right. Remember, they saw this not only in the destruction being done to the church, or I should say the bishoprics, but there was mass civil war erupting also in Germany and France and Italy. So it wasn't simply kind of a divorced clerical argument. People were actually seeing armies marching down the countryside, fighting each other over these issues. So
Yeah, so that's definitely why we're going to touch on this today. So we're going to, without further ado, if everyone's looking inside the About tab, we actually did include a link this time. I apologize for not including it for the past 2 years. I'm probably going to revise all these videos as we move them to other sources like BitChute, so that we can have them labeled properly. So in any case, the link to it is below. So if you want to click on it, we'll go through this text, and then what Peter Crassus has to say.
Now, remember, it's an abridged text, so
Yeah, that's one thing to keep in mind. This is not the full text. Um, these are the relevant passages. When we do have time, we are going to go into the Latin. That's not happening today. And we're going to go into the full text, but the amount of text that's here is enough to establish what we're saying. So this is something that's worth investigating. If you've never heard of it, read it. You'd be surprised at how. First off, what impressed me on this text, just right in the beginning, he immediately begins. Peter Crassus immediately begins referring to Saint Gregory the Great and Saint Augustine. So they took these holy figures as not just as spiritual sources, but as even legal ones. So this is something to keep in mind, that even the system that existed before the Hildebrandian system was based on the fathers. It was not just based on arbitrary rulings. So this is another change that we see occur after Hildebrand. The creation of the concept of canon law itself was something that was largely unknown. There was law, and there was the fathers buttressing the law, but the concept of independent canon law that you see in Roman Catholicism didn't really exist.
Well, remember, Roman law, canon law, in the sense of the Nomo canon, the Pedalion, what we find in the canons, that's not that different than the biblical and the Roman law. They were all, for example, it was known in Constantinople at the time that if you had a degree in quote unquote secular law, you had enough training also to be a quote unquote canon lawyer, so to speak.
Right.
Because it was essentially the same concepts. So, what I propose here, Father, so I don't interrupt you again.
No, I'm done. Please, no.
Is for you to begin reading the text, Defense of King Henry, and when you get to a point where you want to discuss something, you stop and you ask for comments. You make a comment, I'll make a comment, so we have some sort of way of interacting without talking over each other. Okay?
All right, sounds good.
Okay, go ahead.
All right, so we'll start with the first paragraph. It's numbered, so the defense of King Henry, abridged version to King Henry, and it starts with, "Among all the tribulations of human life, our present age has produced the one type of man so far removed from the customs and integrity of life of former times as to be virtually unknown to nature, so that one wonders whether there has not been some form of miscegenation, or that it does not derive from the previous generation. For, O King, this type shows itself so repugnant in respect of loyalty, justice, truth, and all of the other virtues, the agents of the soul's salvation, so as either to be wholly ignorant of them, or if knowing them, to hold them in hatred. I have, O King, decided to write this work so that none of these should ever be able to sustain the case that your high magnanimity, thank you, did not acquire your majesty's crown lawfully, but only by force of arms, and to set out plainly your beatitudes, equity, and justice. Further, since that monk from Satan's synagogue," this is a reference to Hildebrand, Gregory VII, "would repudiate as a possible judicial forum the Roman laws, which I shall show in my work he so vehemently rejects, I am sending your magnificence, in case of need, the work wherein the blessed Gregory the Great is in Blessed Gregory, and it's assumed the Great is assumed. So that's how important he was in the time. Lays out the respective uses in Holy Church of the civil and ecclesiastical laws." I actually want to stop here for a second, because just in that paragraph, we can see conceptually how different the West thought before the takeover of the Hildebrandians. And I'm focusing on that last sentence because of the fact, when we discussed Ladika, when we discussed divorce and remarriage, we made reference to the Code of Justinian, and we made reference to the secular law which the church used. In this sense, he begins talking about how St. Gregory the Great lays out the respective usages in the church of the civil and ecclesiastical laws. This is something important to realize, is that the church was not something, as you pointed out before, Vladika, there was no concept of church and state. There was a symphony. And so the church made use of the secular, and I put secular law, I should just say the civil law.
Yes.
Just as much as the ecclesiastical.
In the civil authorities made usage of the ecclesiastical laws.
Exactly. So the idea that there was something where the state allowed divorce but the church didn't is insane. It just did not exist.
Because it would have made no sense. It would have meant the priesthood would have been in consistent opposition in excommunicating the anointed authority, which they had set up, or they had to anoint it. Okay.
Okay, so we continue on. Let me just get back to where we are. So the second paragraph, the Blessed Augustine, that most acute commentator on Holy Scripture, after recording in his book on the Lord's words, how the Lord's saint maintains that men holding the episcopal dignity are divided into three categories, adds, quote, if we define these three categories of person, your holiness will detect those to hold in affection, those to tolerate, and those of whom to beware. But the Roman people, lax in their own law, rejoice to have as their own pastor in the Holy Roman Church just that third type, the one against whom he warned us. And this pastor, spurning the laws and reportedly gaining that venerable see by fraud, brazenly works to retain it by force. Now, this is something that it's mentioned in the introduction. And so basically, even though he's laying this out, he's kind of laying out the history of how Hildebrand came to power. So this is something to keep in mind. And we'll continue. Since none can be found among the clergy who knows in his heart that this is so, or grieves at that fatal violence, or brings aid to his holy mother, the church, or the laws against him who challenges the law, I have taken the work upon myself, moved by indignation, to find out what reason that guide of the human race judges in this matter. I find that none of this pastor's supporters have ever done this, which was not a tedious task. So this is just a quick comment on this. That basically, Peter Crassus here is, what he's doing is he's laying this out that basically what they're doing is illegal. It's completely illegal, not acceptable. We like to use the term very often in Orthodoxy today, uncanonical. He's basically laying out this very case. So, the point is that's what this purpose is. So we have an ellipsis here. I definitely want to see the further part of this, but it continues, justice and truth are correctly seen to be overthrown by the teachings and judgments of the Roman pastor who has publicly violated each of these principles, that of preaching, and that he has turned peace into war and harmony into sedition, and that of judgment, and that he contravenes the apostles' judgment. Do not judge prematurely. He's quoting from 1 Corinthians 4:5. In respect of that upright, valorous, austere, magnificent, generous, beneficent, good, lawfully minded King Henry IV, it should have occurred to him to ask by what right he could pass a lawful judgment. Gregory the Great says in his letter to King Recared, he who does not judge himself first rightly does not know how to judge others. In thus striking unjustly at King Henry, he is also expressly guilty of striking at all the Catholic emperors, whose holy works equaled the preaching of the faith in building and establishing the Holy Church on the foundations laid by the apostles. Indeed, by their government brought more numerous companies of men to the Lord's threshing ground than did the preachers by their preaching. At one time, the Christian emperors were in harmony with the popes and with the other bishops in the East in fighting heretics and in purifying the Holy Church from the evil errors of heresy. On this, Leo, referring to Leo, Pope St. Leo I, that man of apostolic holiness wrote to the Emperor Theodosius, quote, insofar as divine providence has taken thought for human affairs, manifestly it is the Spirit of God that has aroused your clemency's concern that there shall be no turmoil in the Catholic Church and no wish for no conflict, since the faith, which is nothing if not one, can in no way differ within itself. Christ our Lord preached to his disciples as being the mother and nourisher of all good men, when he said, my peace I give you, my peace I leave with you. John 14:27. So that's the end of the second part. I don't know if you have any comments on this part, Vladika.
Notice how he says at one time the Christian emperors were in harmony with the popes and with the other bishops in the East in fighting heretics. So the Christian emperors are who? The Christian emperors are Henry IV and who? The Byzantine emperor.
Right.
They were at one time in harmony with the popes. Well, I think at this time, let me correct. At this time, it's around 1082. This was written. Clement III or Wiebert had not officially been proclaimed as Clement III. Actually,
Yeah.
I think it was around 1084. So he's still writing in the sense about Hildebrand is still claiming to be the Pope. Okay, even though he doesn't accept the claim, he's calling him the Pontiff of Rome on some occasions. But notice it's interesting that the people in Ravenna, Peter Crassus representing them, is more than willing to say that, look, it's these figures, these claimants to the papacy that have disrupted the unity between the Christian emperors and the other bishops in the West and in the East, which is a reference, I think, to the Great Schism he's talking about here. And so he harkens back to the earlier periods, like the great Pope St. Leo I and the Emperor Theodosius II, I believe, when they were, you had a Western Orthodox Pope and the Eastern Orthodox Emperor who were in harmony together, fighting heresy, as opposed to now where you have a claimant to the papacy, Hildebrand, dividing the Christian emperors and the Christian populations in East and West. So
now I'm going to add that to the screen because why not? We can do that. And so, all right, so we continue on. And it says, what then, you Patarines? I feel like we should just a quick reminder of who the Patarines were.
The Patarines were a group of crypto-Gnostic heretics that existed in northern Italy. They may have existed before that. Initially they attacked married clergy and would attack married clergy, murder them. There was a famous proponent of them, Arnolfo Landolfo, I can't remember his name. He's actually declared a martyr by the Roman Catholic Church. And he created various riots in Milan and in northern Italy where they would attack married clergy. He said you could steal anything you wanted from married clergy because they were all adulterers. And many were killed. And what happened with this fellow, who was one of the leaders of the Patarines, was he got caught up with somebody's family who got in a fight with him, and he got killed, and then he was declared a martyr. Similar to Kuncevich. Everybody knows who he is. But
Joseph Kuncevich. Yeah.
Now, if you remember, Benzo of Alba says that Anselm of Lucca, I believe, who became Alexander II or one of those fellows, was actually one of the creators or one of the prime leaders in the 11th century of the Patarines. Now, the Patarines eventually, after the Hildebrandians took over, they manifested completely, or they were revealed publicly, to be complete Gnostic heretics. And they were stamped out because there was no longer any usage for them. Because I think what happened is once they got rid of the married clergy, they thought, well, let's get rid of marriage altogether. At that point, they were.
That was where basically, you can't go that. They were like that. That's a little too much.
But it's noticeable that oftentimes in revolutions you will have certain groups that will be used, and then, for example, it's like Stalin in the 30s getting rid of all the people who helped.
Trotskyites.
Exactly.
Yeah, I was going to say.
It's similar to that. Okay, but the Patarines were this semi or crypto-Gnostic group that were allied with the Hildebrandians and getting rid of the married clergy, and they were the violent form of it. I mean, they were all violent, but these guys were crazy. So,
okay, so we continue on. So what then, you Patarines? So you hold Christ the Lord to be the giver of peace. You have often heard or understood his apostles preaching of peace. You know how the Christian emperors, with the popes and other most holy fathers, have striven with great energy to amplify and maintain it. It is for this that King Henry, by God's concession, entered into kingship, to be the custodian of this peace and to govern without conflict with your pastor. This is the origin of kingship is clearly witnessed by the prophet Daniel. The kingdom belongs to God, to give to who he wishes. Daniel 4:14. Note well, I pray you, that the prophet does not say that the kingdom belongs to your pope, but to God, by whom unambiguously it has been given to Henry. If offending against King Henry's peace, your pope's arrogance has offended also all those who proclaimed and defended it, and their condemnation of him is unanimous. However, you Patarines claim that you defend your Pope Gregory in the name of God, declaring him to be a holy man ruling from the Holy See. But your declaration is not readily comprehensible, and I suspect that within it lurks a danger, since where the divine power proclaims peace, he promotes war against peace, like those of whom truth says, who is not with me is against me. Matthew 12:30. Therefore, to defend in God's name, a man as guilty as he seems to me, nothing else but to offend God in the name of God. So why, Patarines, do you not realize your bondage in defense of your Pope, and this exaltation of him as though he were rather the ruler of the Church, when he is unanimously condemned as being outside the Church? For Augustine says, quote, association with the Church and fellowship of the Holy Spirit is to be denied to him who with false heart engages himself in the body of Christ's flock. So that's the third section. And if you, I don't know if you want to add anything to this, because I mean, basically, he's go ahead.
Well, remember he says unanimously condemned as being outside the church. That's a reference to Brixen and several other councils in the late 1070s, which declared Hildebrand to either be deposed from the papacy or to never have validly been elected to begin with, and to have been excommunicated for heresy and schism.
And that is something that we do find in the period, that there's the two different schools of thought, that either A, he was validly deposed, or B, he was never a pope to begin with. Mm-hmm. So these are it's just, what I find interesting is the fact that we tend to take for granted the reading of history that says that that there was this that basically. If you read many of the books on the investiture controversy, many of whom are written by papal scholars, they kind of take it as, just an accomplished fact that Hildebrand was the Pope, when the people at the time had no concept of this. Mm-hmm. Most of them simply viewed him as deposed or not really valid to begin with. So it's important to realize that how big of a difference the description of history versus history actually is.
Mm-hmm. Now remember also, just skip ahead a little bit in the future.
Sure.
When the forces of Emperor Henry, and those loyal to the old system drove Hildebrand out of Rome around 1084, 1085, and Wibert of Ravenna was officially elected to be Clement III, and then he consecrated Henry IV to be emperor with anointing of Holy Chrism. That there were some clergy, all the clergy of Rome, or most of the clergy, accepted Wibert of Ravenna or Clement III. However, there were some segments that did not, and still technically, even though they did not like Hildebrand, they claimed some sort of loyalty to him. But what's interesting about those who, in some sense, defended Hildebrand in Rome after he was expelled, was they didn't deny that he had done all these things, and nor did they deny that he could be deposed. They made the argument that you'd have to have some sort of general council to depose him, and it could not be done with councils, I guess, in various provinces. So even the defenders, who were few and far in between at that time in Rome, of Hildebrand, had not gone to the point of even accepting Hildebrand's teaching that it was not that a council could not depose him. They just argued about should it be a general council as opposed to a series of smaller provincial councils. So even Hildebrand, Hildebrand, of course, believed no one could depose the Pope. It was impossible. But even among those who he had under his control in Rome, not everybody was quite willing to accept that, even though they went along with things he did. So that shows you how even revolutionary the Hildebrandian thought system was. So,
well, I mean, because I know that we've mentioned the Dictatus Papae, it is translated on Wikipedia. I do want to just go through some of the points there of it, because of the fact that can be easily forgotten. And what I mean by that is that the concept that was so innovative, the concepts that were so innovative, and the concepts that make up, the teachings of the Roman Church now, even if in its own, kind of, I guess you could say, modified form after Vatican II. But those principles, if we're to look at them, basically they haven't changed. And from that end, give me just one moment while I add that. So, if we look at the list of principles that are, we of course start with the Roman Church, was founded solely by God. But more importantly, and then only the Pope, with him would right be universal. This is where this is relevant. He alone can depose or reinstate bishops. All bishops are below his legate and council, even if a lower grade. He can pass sentence of deposition against him. I'm going to, just quickly skip to some of the most important ones. Number 8, he alone may use the imperial insignia. 12, it may be permitted for him to depose emperors. 13, it may be permitted for him to transfer bishops if need be. So, 16, no synod shall be called a general synod without his order. Now, I wanted to bring those up because these are the very concepts that these people are fighting about. And so this is something that's, very important. That's okay. I see you put a different link, which I will change that to. Give me just one moment.
That's from the same website as the translation of Peter Crassus.
Right, hold on, let me change it. Whoosh, and share screen. And okay. So yeah, these basically you can see that clearly these concepts are the very things we're talking about. In other words, because they are talking about them, because they're arguing against them, the idea that the Pope held some sort of universal authority was one that was repugnant to the people of his time. As you know, Flanica, even the people who supported Hildebrand didn't support his crazy ideas. And so this is something that has to be, hammered down, especially when you're dealing with papal apologetics who, it's been like I've heard recently, and, I want to talk about this later because it was put on the War Zone, the idea that, like, most of the papacy existed before the investiture controversy or before the time of the Great Schism. Yeah. It just isn't. It's not real.
Well,
go ahead.
Yes. So, I think we should get back to reading the text. But all I'll say about the Dictatus Papae is that attempts by Hildebrandian canonists in the 1090s and early 12th century to find reference to all of these texts oftentimes appeal to the Pseudo-Isidorian decretals, all right, which were fraudulent. Secondly, they would take out of context references or quotes in papal decretals, rescripts, letters, councils. Okay, so someone might be able to find something where a pope, maybe some provincial synod wrote to a pope in the 7th century asking, could the archbishop of so and so be transferred to become archbishop of this other place? And the pope holds a council and says, I agree to that. Okay, and then they extrapolate from that in the Dictatus Papae a universal power. All right. Whereas this may have originally been an agreement reached among the patriarch or their own patriarch who have privileges by custom, along with provincial synods approving. And similar, you can find similar instances in a few other. For example, that of the Pope alone, all princes shall kiss the feet. Well, first off, that's kind of ridiculous because one, you kiss the feet of the emperor, you kiss the Eastern, the Western emperor, you kiss the feet of the king. Technically, that was an attempt in the 11th century to reserve that right alone to the Pope, because it used to be when any bishop, pontiff, that was the Western word for hierarch, celebrated the Mass, and he was in his cathedra, when the deacons came up to him to ask his blessing for reading the gospel, they had to, if it wasn't a Sunday, they had to prostrate and kiss his shoe. Now, we don't do that now, but that was a right reserved for people of senatorial rank. And bishops were automatically granted senatorial rank. So you would have to do that even when you came into the imperial senate in Constantinople. Magistrates might have to kiss the feet of, the consul of the senate or something like that. All right, but that didn't.
Kissing feet was a common thing back then, basically.
Yes, just kissing hand. They wore special shoes to begin with. I mean, it wasn't like they were wearing muddy shoes or anything like that. But this was a highly traditional Christian societies were highly hieratic in their understandings, and hierarchic.
Yeah.
And what Dictatus Papae is simply an attempt to take out of context all these things, try to impose it upon people who may be ignorant of all these customs that were even still had not fallen out of use all the way in all places in the West, and then just say, you see, I found this letter where it says the Pope did this, and so forth. But I just wanted to add that. But I think we should get back to the text.
I agree. Yep. Okay, so let's do that. Hold on one moment.
Section 4.
Okay, hold on a moment, please. Okay. And so after laying out this kind of material, which points in one direction, reason now starts to suggest most strongly that I should put down some of the passages presenting the high prudence of King Henry's clergy and suggesting to his most blessed highness that of his own authority he summon a synod. Since there were many clergy who promoted this long-standing error, the king deigned to summon the religious bishops, most of them from Italy as well as from beyond the Alps, men worthy of respect for their manner of life, their learning, and their prayerfulness, fit to sit in judgment in such an assembly. It was also appropriate and reasonable that in such a synod the treasurers of the Italian dioceses should sit, as well as many of the clergy worthy of esteem for their conduct as churchmen and for their education. It was considered right and proper to summon to that synod the Roman pastor, under pain of war being canonically levied against him. For the laws of the church practice require ecclesiastical authority. For at the very outset of his aberration, even before this monk learned of the use of money to fight, he should have recourse not to physical weapons, but to those of the law and legal process. Without these, the prevailing party would have gained glory without such sacrifice of armed followings, while on the resolution of this case, the loser would have suffered the appropriate penalty. But warfare and the recourse to arms is wholly different. There each party is exposed to the same risks, and each places its trust in either its shield or its legs to avoid death. Following this argument, I say to you, you who guide the human race, I write to you as you instruct me, fear greatly that these men, calling themselves Patarines, have arbitrarily drawn articles out of the corpus of the law in order to boast of muzzling my boldness.
Mm-hmm.
But since the laws by which emperors and kings have the duty of restraining the wrongdoing of men are now held everywhere null and void, the kingdom is riddled with injustice, while the monk Hildebrand, who spurns the canons, rejoices in wielding the royal power with his army. The king, with all lovers of justice, finds his burden increased. Through the monk Hildebrand's deceits they stray into grave error. That is why the blessed Gregory I declares, quote, who has ever undertaken the task of preaching the word of Christ is not fitted for the burden of secular business, lest with his shoulders bowed by this he cannot rise to the preaching of the things of heaven, end quote. But ever since ambition allied itself with the license in the Roman Church to claim civil functions, it is his pleasure to hold the decrees of the Holy Fathers to be no longer of any account, the laws no longer to have any validity, and to set up controversial innovations in all matters of religion. So the Roman Empire, its laws diminished, ends in the loss of all its adornment. To cite only one among many episodes, the monk Hildebrand began assembling a great amount of money, by which not many years ago he was able to exercise a perverted authority in the Church of Milan, where he was serving for some years. He was guilty of causing a man's tongue, nose, and ears to be cut off. This man had been assigned to assist him at God's altar, where none of the senior clergy were willing to assist him. In the bishopric of Cremona, some empty-headed woman named Albizia, despite the apostles' injunction that women should stay silent in the church, 1 Corinthians 14:34, preached from the pulpit itself in the presence of the people with the same authority as the apostles. The bishopric of Nonantola, in defiance of God's law, but in conformity with his own, he deprived of its leader. So this unchecked disregard of law leads him to throw both the church and the whole kingdom into confusion.
Now notice interestingly, it speaks about when Hildebrand served in the Church of Milan. He was only I think not even a deacon. He may have been a subdeacon, an acolyte in minor orders. So he had a reputation even there of basically trying to run everything. And remember, Milan is a stepping stone to Rome in the hierarchy in the Western Church, especially in Italy. And of course, he has Albizia, who is his kind of crazed woman visionary, which is apparently something that he's kind of maybe Hildebrand's the one who started that tradition and papism of the crazed lady visionary who has all these visions and preaches and things like that. So anyway,
hey, at least we know where female altar servers started.
Well, he doesn't say she was serving on the altar. He allowed her.
He allowed her to be a reader. So
he allowed her to preach in the pulpit. Probably giving her, her visions like a, Julian Liege, or who was the crazy woman in the Margaret,
Mary Alacoque.
Yeah, exactly. So in that mold. Okay.
All right. So we continue on. What emerges then is that the supporters of the monk Hildebrand have attained such a point of folly as to accuse of falsehood even the Holy Fathers themselves, Gregory, Augustine, Jerome, and the rest, to hold them as enemies and shamelessly to denigrate them in exalting the monk Hildebrand. They preach contempt for the teachings of the Fathers, realizing that these condemn their perversion, and instead sustain and defend King Henry and his sacred prerogative. So that ends the fourth section that we have excerpted here. It's kind of amazing that, here we are looking at a Roman lawyer talking about preserving the traditions of the Holy Fathers versus the innovations of what Hildebrand is creating. So that alone puts to rest the idea that there was no canonical understanding in the West of an Orthodox sense, or that there's this emergent papism that existed 200 years before, or anything of the sort. It was novel. It was novel in the 11th century. It was an innovation, and it was a rejected innovation. So this is something that somebody had asked about creating a solid argument against the papal authority idea. The most solid argument is that the Roman people themselves, by and large, and the Western people themselves, didn't believe in it. It just was not a thing. It wasn't like that could have been a thing. No, they rejected it. They thought it was wrong, and they appealed to the Holy Fathers to make the case that what Hildebrand was creating was, satanic.
Continue.
Okay. So we get to number 5. You whose lawful duty it is to pass judgment on the guilt of this monk, I beg you by the mercy of God, who has established you as judges of his flock, I beg that your excellence consider by what law and with what respect he came to the apostolic see. In making your judgment, listen to the words of St. Benedict in his rule. Quote, when by personal deliberation a monk promises faithfully to observe the rule and to submit himself to total obedience, he shall be admitted to the community, knowing from that moment, as the same rule lays down, he will no longer have license to leave the monastery or cast off of his own accord the yoke of the rule, which the long period of reflection has allowed him to accept or reject. If he owns property, he is either to distribute it to the poor, or by legal deed of gift to cede it without reserve to the monastery, for from then on he is not master even of his own body. End quote. What does your sense of justice conclude in the face of such a statement? Has not this man, who acquired no little money through his threatening letters, discarded the yoke of the rule he was violating? Has he not placed himself in that fourth category of monk, according to St. Benedict, worse than the Cerebite? Has not he, who should no longer be the master of his own body, set himself up to judge the whole world? Sons of men, judge with uprightness so criminous a man, who gave nothing to his monastery, but made off with all the possessions of the blessed Peter's church. What should I say in defense of such a man? My opponents, those called the Patarines, say, they think with some security, that the blessed Gregory I was a monk, but then became a cardinal deacon of the Holy Roman Church, and thence at last came in all worthiness to the apostolic pontificate. So what? The best reply, to my mind, comes from the man's own words, in accounts of his ordination to be read in his life. There the following is written, quote, the venerable Pontiff Benedict, observing how Gregory rose to ever higher levels of virtue, removed him by compulsion from the quiet of his monastery to give him duties in church matters, and he ordained him as his seventh deacon to be his assistant. So the manner in which Benedict, pontiff of the Holy Roman Church, took the blessed Gregory the First, this is Gregory the Great, by compulsion from his monastery is understood to conform to the decree of the Council of Chalcedon and his own episcopal prerogative. So there is clearly nothing against the rule of Father Benedict in this departure. But the monk Hildebrand put himself forward without being summoned, and it is abundantly clear that once out of his monastery he has caused trouble. It therefore clearly follows that in terms of the Council of Chalcedon, he is excommunicate. And then, so, it's, again, now I want to stop here for a sec because there's so much to unpack here. I mean, he's gone from the rule of St. Benedict to the life of St. Gregory to the Council of Chalcedon, all to demonstrate that Hildebrand basically is even worse than a Cerebite. So, because a Cerebite just being, a wandering monk and a crazy person, which is something that, other writers of the time do accuse Hildebrand of being, he points out he's even worse because he's not just a Cerebite, he's basically a thief. He's taken all of the money that he was never supposed, instead of giving away all his money, he took a lot of it. And that's the point that is trying to be established here, that effectively he took the riches of the Church of St. Peter. And in doing so, he's condemned not just by the monastic rule, but also by the lives of the holy popes like St. Gregory, and more importantly, by the holy councils. And he goes, he starts with the Council of Chalcedon, and we get to the next one. It says, what should be done with an excommunicate who, in despite of a council celebrated by so many fathers, has ascended the apostolic throne. Listen to what the Council of Carthage said of such a person. If an, quote, if an excommunicate, before the hearing of his case, should presume to re-enter communion, he shall be damned for all eternity. Therefore, let every diocese know that this monk, assuredly excommunicated on the basis of the condemnation of the Council of Chalcedon, absolved himself, and that the Roman people, which as usual follows the canons, those of money, raised him to the pontifical throne. That's sarcasm, by the way.
It's a reference to the mob, to the Roman mob.
The Roman mob that got all the cash that was, flashed by Hildebrand, so on and so forth. So, who can doubt that he, along those who with those who ordained him, are manifestly struck by the anathema and curse of Gregory? And so, this is, it's refreshing, when you read this, this being written in 1080, because the sense of what, Peter Crassus is saying here is perfectly orthodox. I mean, it's not, there's no hidden, thing to it. It's completely the proper way to look at things. And so the idea that this was a sense that was lost in the West, or this was an Eastern sense versus a Western sense, it didn't exist. It was just an Orthodox sense.
Now he's referring to the Canons of Chalcedon, and he's talking about Canon 4 of Chalcedon. And Canon 4 of Chalcedon says, quote, "Let those who truly and sincerely lead the monastic life be counted worthy of becoming honor, for as much as certain persons under the pretext of monasticism bring confusion both upon the churches and into political affairs by going about promiscuously in the cities, and at the same time seeking to establish monasteries for themselves, it is decreed that no one anywhere build or found a monastery or oratory contrary to the will of the bishop of the city, and that the monks in every city and district shall be subject to the bishop, and embrace a quiet course of life, and give themselves only to fasting and prayer, remaining permanently in the places in which they were set apart, and they shall meddle neither in ecclesiastical nor in secular affairs, nor leave their own monasteries to take part in such, unless indeed they should at any time, through urgent necessity, be appointed thereto by the bishop of the city. And no slave shall be received into any monastery to become a monk against the will of his master. And if anyone shall transgress this, our judgment, we have decreed that he shall be excommunicated, the name of God be not blasphemed. But the bishop of the city must make the needful provisions for the monasteries." So this confirms Peter Crassus's argument that the attempts to say, well, St. Gregory the Great, he was a monk, and then he kind of was made Bishop of Rome, and that's similar to Hildebrand. Peter Crassus' argument is that no, this is not what happened. In the life, as he quotes, of St. Gregory the Great, and what happened is that Pope St. Benedict, I guess the first, I'm not sure, I think it was the first, takes St. Gregory out of the monastery by compulsion, since he was the bishop, since St. Gregory lived in Rome, he had a monastery in Rome, all right? So his ruling bishop, at that time, the Bishop of Rome says, no, leave, you're going to become a deacon and serve me. So he does that under obedience. And that's different than Hildebrand, who was I think a monk up in France, and then he kind of wandered around, and then he got himself made, archdeacon eventually, and all the rest. All right. So anyway, that's Canon 4. Peter Crassus is referencing Canon 4 of Chalcedon.
Yeah. So this is what impresses me is just the amount of time that Peter Crassus spends on things like the Holy Canons. And you get the impression, especially reading papal writers on the, even after the investiture controversy, that they had no concept of law until there was canon law, and that's not true. They had a very good concept of law, and it was an orthodox concept of law, which was the civil law and the ecclesiastical law. These things were well understood. They were not the idea that there was like a disjointed collections of laws that had to be collected later. It's a fantasy. It's just not real. And so we continue on.
Yes.
What more is there to say? You Saxons, who in receiving the faith and holy baptism extended your hand to the truth, come and listen to me and reckon up the dangers you run. Be alert, I beg you, to the obstinacy with which one single monk labors to destroy and render void the laws which pious emperors have issued for the salvation of you, of your sons, of the whole of Christendom.
Now, just to interrupt briefly, he's addressing the Saxon rebellion. There was an anti-king named Rudolf, who was Duke of the Saxons or something like that. And through money and in political intrigue, Hildebrand encouraged him to proclaim himself king and to try to kill Emperor Henry IV and to overthrow the empire. So there was a Saxon rebellion being led by this Rudolf. So that's what he's talking
Which was
about.
being paid, yeah.
Yes, and Hildebrand's money largely came from the Perleone banking family. Anyway.
Okay. Therefore, Saxons, your sense of justice should well understand by what great goodwill the lawgiver established for you and your children, as for other peoples, that the law be observed in the text of the laws themselves, or by custom conformable to the law. Know that all these dispositions are sanctioned by the authority of the divine law. Listen to the blessed Gregory I in his letter to Emperor Phocas, where, among other things, he says, quote, each should have security in possession of his own property, and should be able to enjoy without fear what he has acquired honestly. Why do we say all this, Saxons? For is it not on the basis of these laws that King Henry holds his kingship? Can there be, among all mortal men on earth, any so ignorant, stupid, or improvident, so lacking in reason and sense, as to think or believe that an action forbidden by legal sanction against a private individual is lawful against so great a king, or that the prudent intelligence of the lawgiver was so lacking in reason as to wish to include the king, his heirs, and successors, exclude the king, his heirs, and successors from the benefits of the law. So, basically, I still just remain in awe of how much reference is made to not just the ecclesiastical and secular law, but the Holy Fathers themselves. He's quoting extensively, as we can see from Saint Gregory, as well as other people, other Holy Fathers, to establish the illegality of what Hildebrand is doing. And so we continue. Who does not stand appalled at the folly of one who, without the law and contrary to law, declares that emperors and kings cannot have their sons as heirs to their kingship? In ancient times, the consuls could not do so, but kings and emperors have always had this right. See, therefore, Saxons, it is not clearly affirmed that it is neither within your power, nor that of the monk Hildebrand, to make decisions on the kingship which heaven has granted to Henry, for no one can doubt that kingships are in the gift of the will of God. So then I'm going to stop for a second here, if you don't mind.
Let me make a few comments.
Sure.
One of the arguments that's being used here, as we saw in Dictatus Papae, is the claim that whoever claims to be Pope of Rome has the right to depose kings or emperors. Now, there was an attempt during Hildebrand's time to found this upon what transpired around 750 in France. And it's a complicated story, but basically what happened in 750 in France was that Pippin, who was mayor of the palace, there was a coup where he kind of deposed King Childeric III, I think, and he declared himself king, and Pope Zachary was asked whether it was acceptable, and he said, sure, you can do that. And so the Hildebrandian interpretation is that, you see, Pope Zachary, he deposed King Childeric, and he made Pippin king. Where I don't remember if Peter Crassus addresses this further down, but what happened actually was this: there were several periods there were at least 2 or 3 periods of interregnum in the Merovingian dynasties in the early 700s. The mayors of the palace, who were kind of like the prime ministers, became increasingly effective. The king became kind of this more and more removed figure. And what transpired was that when you get to Childeric's time, is even doubted. We're not quite sure where Childeric came from. Was he the son of the previous king? Was he some sort of relative they set up? But he was set up by Pippin. And apparently he was thought to be completely ineffective. He had no power. He was considered by some to be incompetent. And the nobility in Gaul simply said, look, this guy can't be king. He can't even do anything. The mayors of the palace have been effectively ruling the kingdom for 40 or 50 years. And they engage in a kind of a bloodless coup. And they write to Pope St. Zachary and they said, do you think it's acceptable that either the person who has the real power should be king, or the guy who is king but has no power should be king? And Pope Zachary says, well, I guess the guy who has the real power should be king, and not the guy who has the name of king should be king. And at that point, what was already accomplished was simply given a further confirmation. And that's the Carolingian dynasty was founded. I mean, and you can criticize that it wasn't done properly, and I agree that there's stuff going on there, but a set of backroom deals, or the Pope kind of agreeing to something that's already being done by the entire kingdom, that's not the same as a Pope declaring an emperor who already has legitimate authority and is popular deposed because that emperor disagrees with the ecclesiastical and dogmatic and canonical policy of that Pope at the time. Are you there, Father?
Yeah, I'm here.
So do you see that's the background of a lot of these discussions. They're trying to say, you see, Pope Zachary agreed to the kind of the deposition of. He agreed to it. He didn't legislate to begin with. He agreed to the removal of King Choderic, which had already been accomplished. Therefore, this gives Hildebrand the right to proactively depose anybody he so wishes. So that's an example in Dictatus Papae where they took an earlier precedent, they twisted it, and contorted its meaning to the point where it doesn't mean what it originally. It doesn't have the same meaning. If you know what I mean.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So we continue on reading the treatise of Peter Crassus. But to continue, who does not know that the Emperor Constantine in his will divided the kingship among his sons, and Gratian, who made Theodosius his colleague in the kingship, would he have not been able to have made his son an heir if he had one? But passing over the ancients, let us come to our own people. We read that Charlemagne was given the government of the kingdom for the defense of the Roman Church in all of Italy, whose enemies he expelled, and at his death left the kingship peaceably to his son. The latter, before his death, divided the kingship among his 3 sons, and since this division led to some unbrotherly strife among them, the Pope sought through his legates to re-establish peace. This shows how the Apostolic See should always be the promoter of peace, not of war. Some years later, again to defend Italy, the imperial power was again assigned to Otto. In the histories of him is found, quote, at a time when the most pious King Otto I was anointed as emperor in Rome, as the Lord Pope John, the universal Pope, sat in synod, etc. To him, by divine concession, there succeeded his son and then his grandson. When fatal destiny brought the latter to death, we know that the same imperial dignity, always by divine dispensation, passed to the ancestors of King Henry and then to himself. None of the emperors has gained such honor, such glory, such praise in the defense of Italy as has King Henry and his ancestors. Nobody in Italy, I may say, has ever dared openly to oppose their power or line, unless it was this monk Hildebrand, the enemy of the law, the enemy of peace, the enemy of all Christendom, with those whom he has deceitfully reared up against the majesty of the empire. So you have heard, Saxons, that King Henry is the lawful holder of the kingship, on the basis of both the laws and customs conformable to them. But we know that your own prudence is not to be held wholly guilty in this respect, since you thought that it was the Apostle Peter speaking through this monk's mouth. But to appreciate and benefit from the truth, I beg you, use your intelligence. You know clearly that this monk Hildebrand, in his great arrogance, summoned King Henry on several occasions to judgment before him. But I believe that your sense of justice is ignorant of the deceits and faithless cunning with which he tried to procure proofs of the charges against him. And so the monk Hildebrand, against every norm in the divine teaching, was the author of an unprecedented falsehood, such as no bishop has ever issued in his own church. Who can endure a pastor who is always searching for ways of inflicting harm on Christ's flock, to which instead he should be giving every help? Now King Henry, with extraordinary and unprecedented humility, presents himself before him, acknowledging him as his spiritual father. In public, rumor ran, the monk Hildebrand spoke of the salvation of the king's soul, but in private, using the utmost malice and faithless cunning, he looked for ways of removing him from the kingship and bringing him and his sons to death. But in the name of God, the faith of God and St. Peter, which you always seem to keep intact and pure among you, consider how this monk's actions contradict the teaching of the blessed Peter.
Now let me stop you here for a second, Father.
Sure.
He says now he is now going through historical examples here. He says, now, how was it in other parts of the treatise, King Henry, Emperor Henry, and Peter Crassus are attacking Hildebrand as not legitimate pope, but now he's saying he's a spiritual father. Well, he's referring here to the incident that happened 3 years or 4 years previously called the Road to Canossa, which is an exaggerated incident. It says, now King Henry, with extraordinary and unprecedented humility, now, so he's speaking in the kind of historical now, if you know what I mean, presents him before him, acknowledging him as his spiritual father. So what happens is that Henry is convinced by various family members who were siding with Hildebrand that will just make peace with Hildebrand. They claim that he kind of walked barefoot. We're not really sure if that actually happened. That may have been a later 12th century or later propagandist reasoning. There does seem to he had a meeting with Hildebrand. They had some sort of reconciliation. But even before they left Canossa, something had happened. And not long after, any kind of reconciliation broke up completely. So what happens is that obviously this was a mistake of King Henry, but Peter Crassus is bringing it out to show the humility of King Henry, that he's willing to, because remember, technically, they haven't. When was Brixen? Was it 1078? 1080. Okay, so this is 1077 is Canossa. Okay, so Henry's trying to, maybe I can try to make it work with this Pope, Hildebrand, even though he's done all this terrible stuff to me, and he's destroying everything. And Henry basically, submits and says, "Oh, you can be my spiritual father." And publicly, Hildebrand speaks about his desire to help the king. But what happens in reality is Hildebrand is secretly plotting against him.
Well, it's worth noting that, again, as we have pointed out before, that history being written by the winner, the walk to Canossa is often presented as when the temporal authority basically ceded itself to the Pope. And this is, even at the time, considered completely wrong, even though this was, basically the partisans of Hildebrand's arguments then. So it's important to keep in mind that even the walk to Canossa was seen as something that out of the... Go ahead.
And now remember also, this is in the midst of the attempts of the civil war of Duke Rudolph of Swabia, the anti-king. So you had all these nobles that were declaring the Salian dynasty vacant. They were claiming that the Pope had deposed him. There was war. I think even the king's mother was under some negative influence to try to get him to reconcile. People were attacking him. That's the context of which he came to some sort of temporary agreement with Hildebrand that didn't last more than, a month or so or something like that, because it didn't last very long to begin with. Anyway.
Yeah, well, it's definitely important that we get the I guess you could say we get the
that's the context of the paragraph in that sense.
Okay, so now let's continue on. Okay, so we get to number 7. What more does not the monk Hildebrand's hypocrisy show in every word of his dealings with the king? Who can deny that so sorrowful an affair, so disruptive of the kingdom, was the work of the intrigues of the monk Hildebrand, against whom, in Job's words, the earth howls and its furrows weep? Even more, the monk Hildebrand chose himself a commander and arrayed an army, a thing forbidden by St. Peter, to invade the kingdom. He then returned to Rome, called a council, and once again summoned to judgment the king whose enemy, through Hildebrand's obstinacy, was already assailing him. The monk Hildebrand could have Duke Rudolph and his army and all the Saxons fighting the king, but he could find nobody proper to uphold the charges. Does it not follow, then, judges, that the monk Hildebrand sentenced Henry to the loss of his kingship in defiance of all the teachings of the Holy Fathers? It is clearly shown that in the judgment against Henry he was the accuser, witness, and judge, something that the most holy pontiff Fabian prohibited in these words, quote, "No one should presume to be at once accuser, judge, and witness." I want to stop here because this is actually a pretty ancient canonical principle. I mean, this was one that St. John Chrysostom used at the Synod of the Oak, because he recognized that the judges were his accusers. So this is, that can never happen. It's even enshrined, I think, in civil law, even today, to some degree. It's considered a conflict of interest. So we continue.
We would say you can't be judge, jury, and prosecutor.
Right, exactly. Who therefore can doubt that Henry is king, whom the apostle St. Peter commends in the words, quote, "For the love of God, be subject to all human institutions, both to the king as sovereign and to the governors as his representatives, to punish malefactors and reward the good," quote, and again, quote, "Hold in respect, love your brethren, fear God, and honor the king." That's from 1 Peter, the 2nd chapter. And that was a pagan king. I mean, a Christian king, that would be even, unthinkable in this era. And so the idea that they could foment rebellion against a king who had done nothing wrong was shocking. And so we continue. It says, "So, judges, examine strictly this monk. Against the apostle Peter, he has condemned the man whom the apostle himself commended. From motives of glory for himself, he has brought the whole kingdom to ruin. How then have the Romans sinned in respect of this monk, whom he leads not to life, but to the shadows of the Styx? He has bought them and calls them true martyrs, but the ministers of hell will not take ransom for them. Am I to keep silent on how this monk brought spiritual and physical death to Duke Rudolph and his followers by openly spurring him on to perjury and the killing of his own lord? Listen to the words of the blessed Gregory on this question in the letter sent to King Recared of the Goths, where he speaks of Zedekiah, the king of the children of Israel, whom God threatened through the prophet for breaking his oath taken to Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. Ezekiel 17:16. The punishment imposed by this pagan king should make you judges reflect on the severity of this sentence to be imposed on the breaker of an oath to a Christian king on whom he deceitfully wages war. You should consider in your holy judgment the sentence to impose on one through his own perverted preaching has induced men ignorant of the laws to pass from loyalty, peace, and harmony to anger, hate, perjury, and attempts to kill their own Lord, seducing them with money from their fealty. The apostle conforms to the prophet in declaring that if a pastor stains himself with killing, he ought to suffer as a murderer. It is indeed written, quote, if anyone who preaches the word of Christ has committed any fault within the church, he ought not to retain his office, but be expelled from the church and spurned by all, end quote. Who believes that this sentence can apply to anyone but the monk Hildebrand and his followers, marked by the Holy Fathers as heretics to be removed from the church? The darkness of his error cannot obscure the virtues of holy bishops or the holiness of life of the abbots and monks, whose teachings and merits are the support and stability of Holy Church. Oh, excuse me a moment while I get a little water here.
Okay. I'll continue reading while you drink.
Okay. Right. No problem.
It says, what further charges await, judges? Was not this monk sent to the pontificate the cause of all this disturbance? The Christian religion has been in confusion and grief ever since he became its guardian. Indeed, he is even more to be held in abomination by all, in that from the very outset of his wicked work, he did not begin with little things, but passed straight to the theft and plundering of the church's wealth. And bad as was his means of acquisition, still worse was the manner of his spending. Does not the monk Hildebrand also show himself brutish, who holds that the edification of souls, what the Holy Fathers did by preaching the word, is effected by killing with the sword? So Hildebrand is obviously shown to be one of the people obviously trying to institute an early version of the Crusades, except the Crusades first began in the attempt to overthrow, or at least the Crusades in the 11th century, in this sense, began in the attempts to overthrow the German emperors and to institute Ultramontanism and the Dictatus Papae and to enshrine that in the West. Are you there, Father?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, can you continue from section 8?
Okay.
Very last.
It is the laws themselves, you Saxons, which call you, along with your master, into court to render account to King Henry for the invasion of his kingdom. Listen to what is written in the 8th book of the Codex. Whoever, before the outcome of a judicial case, shall dare to take forceful possession of property entrusted either to the public treasury or to private persons in anticipation of judgment, shall restore all that he has taken to the person he has dispossessed, and he shall lose all his rights in them. Whoever has taken possession of these aforementioned goods shall not only restore them, but shall be constrained to reimburse their value. What then, Saxons? Have you understood the obligation to restore the kingship which you have seized, and to reimburse Henry with the value? It is furthermore stated in the Institutes that the Lex Julia Majestatis, which has force over those who in any way act against the emperor of the state, or the state, lays down the death penalty and the damnation of the guilty man's memory after his death. Therefore, Saxons, since such severe laws bring such severe reprisals, it is best to refer all to the judge's mercy, so that King Henry, in his benevolence and pity, may mitigate the law's rigors, and of his mercy grant pardon to as many as seek it. It should not arouse wonder if men ignorant of the laws can be turned from their loyalty at the instigation of him who occupies the see from which we all receive the faith. But we must be watchful and vigilant in all times and in all places, for indeed we cannot sleep securely alongside a snake.
Yes. So
this is a great picture.
Yeah. The first picture is Wiebert of Ravenna and Henry sitting together, and the second one is they're casting out
Hildebrand. Yeah.
It says Gregory VII because this was a manuscript written from the Hildebrandian perspective,
right?
What it is. But anyway, yeah.
Yeah, they kind of made Clement III's eyes look all blackened, and they made him look like a little skull guy.
But notice they do demonstrate him giving the double-handed blessing, which was common for northern bishops in northern Italy. So yeah. You see that among Eastern Orthodox bishops nowadays, but he does it in the Western form with the two fingers. But anyway, so what do you think, Father?
Okay, well, I mean, I think that this is definitely one of the most, definitely one of the strongest sources you can use to demonstrate the contemporary view of the church and people against Hildebrand at the time. So the concept, it's weird because even the term investiture controversy, it kind of implies it's just kind of a debate with some sycophants on either side, kind of just arguing, could this guy be pope or could this guy? And that's not the way it worked. This was an upheaval of the West that was completely instigated by Hildebrand to create a papal monarchy. And before that, the concept of papal monarchy wasn't just foreign, it wasn't just new, it was heretical. And so this is something that has to be established when you are discussing things with Roman Catholic apologists. If the concept of papal monarchy is allowed to fester in the back of the mind of the person you're talking to, then they're never going to get it, because they're going to be like, oh, well, I'm convinced, that the fathers taught this teaching. No, the fathers not only didn't teach this teaching, they were against this teaching, and more importantly, the West was too. It was only until the political and the military victories of the party of Hildebrand that, the Roman Catholic Church could come into existence. And I want to stress that, again, the words come into existence, because the idea that it developed out of something, there's nothing to support it. There's no historical way to support it. There is absolutely no way from contemporary sources to support it. And that's why it's hidden under the clever name of a controversy. It was not a controversy. It was a civil war for the soul of the Orthodox West. Yeah. A war that unfortunately the West lost.
I mean, we could talk about, I don't know, the European controversy of 1914 to 1918. That was a controversy, right?
Oh, absolutely. There was the German controversy in 1945.
Yeah, the German controversy, or the Hiroshima controversy.
Yeah, exactly. The Japanese controversy. Exactly. They were debating over an island.
Exactly. That's now. Do you wish to connect this to any other issues, any other recent discussions, any other questions, or what?
Well, yeah. I mean, it was it was brought up. It was brought up on the War Zone. This was discussed. I wanted to. I don't know if Craig is if he's around. But in any case, I wanted to point out. I'll just maybe I can put it on the screen. Hold on, because we don't do that enough. Now that I can put things on the screen, I may as well. So, because this ties directly into it, so we're gonna do that. Give me just one moment. I'm gonna switch this to questions and answers. Hold on, and take off the people versus Hildebrand. And we're gonna share the screen again. Hold on, Brave Tab, and we're gonna go to the Amazing War Zone. And so we're going to go to Craig's question. Basically what he said was, I make the quick comments on how can papacy be a heresy if we had papist popes pre-schism. I make the error that everyone has read everything I wrote and watched everything I did on Reason and Theology. For that reason, I presume most people know that there was a 90% papacy lacking modern anachronisms and Vatican I. That being said, the fact that the popes made claims, big ones, but always consented to the church or nothing came of them, just shows the claims were big talk. So Ralph Cramden always tells his wife, bang, zoom, straight to the moon. If one day he did beat his wife, we would take seriously all the things he said. However, he was not guilty of any sin before he actually did it. This is how I view the papacy and why I find the Norman conquest and the Crusades as pivotal, as talk becomes walk and aberrant thoughts and ideas become explicitly sinful. You may still think this is not a cogent view of history, and that's your right, but I wanted to explain my view, being that it caused considerable debate. And there were a lot of comments, like 60 comments. But I think the thing that bothers a lot of people is this 90% papacy thing. I like Craig. I think he's a good person, and I think he's a decent apologist. But this is a good example of ideas that preconceived notions, and they come from historical readings. I mean, as we were talking about, we're joking about the investiture controversy because it was a civil war, but a lot of people really think it was just a controversy, and that's such a mistake. This was not like the Pope and Emperor having a friendly debate. This was literally, again, a battle for the soul of the West. But
yes, I mean, for example, there was the case in Cambrai in France where all the wives of the priests were rounded up and sold into slavery. Not much of a controversy there.
I mean, that one.
Their children were taken from them and sold into slavery. And if there were pretty horrific things happening. There was a civil war going on in Germany at the time. Numerous battles. Look up Rudolph of Swabia. There was consistent support from the Pierleone banking family and from the Hildebrandians for this anti-king who roused up the Saxons. Because remember, they could rouse up the Saxons because the Saxons were, I think, maybe somewhat upset that, I'm not sure where did this, I don't know if the Salian dynasty came from Saxony, but I know the Ottos had come from Saxony. So Hildebrandians and their allies had masterful ways of trying to find disaffected parties who may have been upset that, I don't know, the royal power passed from this province to this other province and then, create a civil war. So you had massive amount of people dying there in Germany. Married priests, you had violence going on in dioceses in France. The things happening in Cambrai I described.
Well, that's actually, it's kind of horrifying.
You have the case in northern Italy where the Patarines, who Peter Crassus mentions and Benzo of Alba mentions, going around and basically murdering or telling crowds or rallying up crowds in cities with money and pseudo prophetic preaching that they can take everything they want from married clergy and they should seize all the property from them. And this was supported by a man named Ariold, by the way, I forgot his name, who was declared a martyr by the papists today, but he was responsible for many atrocities.
Well, one thing I want to kind of drive this home in a realistic perspective, because I don't think people can really appreciate it unless you do that. And what I mean by this is all of us as Orthodox are used to having married clergy around. They're here, they're there. There's monastics and there's married clergy. That's the way we're used to living. Try to imagine if your archbishop suddenly declared all of the priest wives, think of the ones you knew, think of the ones you've met, think of the ones you see on Sunday, and declared them all to be not only invalid adulteresses, but also that they and the priest family should all be sold into slavery. If you put that in perspective, in today's perspective, try to think how it would have been in France to be a priest's wife or a priest's kid, and all of a sudden you go from being the family of the priest to a slave. And the priest is imprisoned or put to death or whatever. But the point I'm trying to make is,
well, they would be slaves. Technically, they later tried to attenuate it by saying, well, they're going to be slaves to the Pope or the Hildebrand.
But that's insane. Still.
I know there's no attenuation. It looks like, because then Hildebrand, of course, can just sell them for more money.
Exactly.
So and then they could instigate various factions in French society who now technically, in places like Normandy and other places in France, slavery had actually been abolished by about the year 1000 AD. They still had serfdom, but serfdom is, despite what people think, is not the same as slavery. Right. A serf had rights to land. You couldn't just kick them off the land. I mean, if you did, you could try it, but then they had a legal right to rebellion. It wasn't considered rebellion or considered asserting their rights, because if they're tied to the land, then they're tied to the land. But a slave, you can do, you could generally, Christian society would have said, you couldn't kill a slave unjustly, but you can still make him do whatever you want almost. Which is why, it gave rise to abuse and why it was abolished by the French kings by multiple decrees until about 1000. So you have now a case where they're trying to bring back slavery, except in the case of what? Wives and children of priests. So they can become slaves. And maybe they'll grant some exemption by saying, well, we'll make them a serf. But still, they're being separated from the wife, from the husband and their father.
Yeah,
and this was especially, they had tried to do this in Anglo-Saxon England when the Normans conquered it. There was a famous synod in Winchester. However, it was massive resistance.
Yeah,
and what transpired was that even some of the Norman clergy were married. So Lanfranc, who couldn't enforce that, and so there was a synod in Winchester in 1070 where they had to have this compromise position where they said.
You can't have future priests.
Yes, but they said the clergy who are in the parishes or in the villages, married deacons and priests are allowed to remain. Those who are in cathedrals and who are canons have to give up their wives, which technically wasn't controversial because canons had taken vows already. But then they said, no, in the future, bishops should not ordain clergy men who are married men or whose wives have not agreed to join a nunnery or something like that. Now, that didn't work out even the Norman period because there was so much antagonism generated in England, even in Norman control, toward Hildebrand in the 1070s, that I don't think the Anglo-Saxon bishop, the Norman bishops didn't go back into communion with the Hildebrandians like 1092 or something like that. There was even controversies in 1094, the Synod of Rockford, when they expelled Anselm and accused him of schism and heresy and such. So there were a lot of times the Hildebrandian communion was oftentimes it would break just as often as anything else, and it was fragile. And as I mentioned, they even had people in Rome who didn't like everything he did, but they kind of went along to get along, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And and that's what happened once the political environment, this military and religious environment changed sufficiently that the old Western Party was simply defeated and killed and driven off, and those who were willing to make a deal made a deal. And that's what eventually became the Gallicans or the Conciliarists in the post-schism Western Church, the people who survived, who were opponents of Hildebrand, but kind of were allowed to remain as long as they made certain concessions. They became the fighting from within, but as often happens, they didn't succeed.
Yeah.
And that's a long history in and of itself about all the fights that happened afterwards and why they consistently were being defeated time after time after time after time, and why Gallicanism became weaker and weaker and weaker, and Ultramontanism was already official, but it was stamping out its opposition in the Western world. And it got to the point where, the papacy was almost on this continuous drive to claim it was going to be friendly to Christian kingship and Christian commonwealth, but it didn't. It simply wanted to destroy all other sources of ecclesiastical, religious, or civil power other than itself, turn kings and metropolitans into simply surrogates for its own authority. And the only thing that stops that short, you have the so-called Babylonian captivity, which was a reaction in which the kings of France tried to get the popes to live in Avignon, which they seceded, so they could, in some way, recapture some of the lost power. That didn't ultimately work out because reform in an orthodox manner had become impossible. You have reform and a deform begins to happen, which happens in what? That's the Reformation.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
And
so people have no other alternative. They've been taught so much not to listen to the Greeks, and they've been given so many false manuscripts and interpolations that people end up throwing the baby out with the bathwater in many cases. The only thing that keeps the papism together after that is, you do have enough people who, even though they're Gallicans, don't agree with all the Protestant stuff, so they're willing to rally around the papacy for a moment, even though you have consistent controversies in the 17th and 18th centuries. I think there was even one of the French kings was assassinated by someone led by the Jesuits, by the way, and that kind of led to the suppression of the Jesuits. And the kings of France, which were kind of the last stopgap measure within post-schism Western world that prevented complete ultramontanism from taking place, was done away with in the Revolution. And of course, the papacy, even though it claims not to, it was more than willing to establish nice relations with the revolutionaries if it thought it could. And then that's when you see the 19th century complete triumph of Ultramontanism. I mean, they were already not the church before then, obviously. But you see how crazy things became, where you have Pius IX, Vatican I, saying, "I am the tradition, and I am the truth." The Christ the King festival was established in the 18th or 19th century to specifically to rebut the attempts by Italian nationalists to unify the peninsula and get rid of. I mean, there were a lot of crummy people in the Italian, nationalists. I mean, a lot of them were atheists. And I don't endorse any of that stuff. But you see what happens when you have an institution like papism, and it ultimately has created a situation where reform in an orthodox direction, or in a primitive direction, which is orthodox direction, which could have led to reunion with orthodoxy, at least among some segments. When that becomes impossible, people then go off into these other crazy avenues. If you know what I mean, Father.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is exactly why when you have to locate where precisely, Rome fell away, it always comes back to the 11th century. And it comes back to the 11th century because of this noxious idea that the Pope was a monarch over the earth in any way, shape, or form. This was unheard of. It was unprecedented. It was not respected by the people of the West at the time, who retained an Orthodox sense and did not believe the ravings of Hildebrand of Savannah. And so ultimately, the concept, the idea that papal monarchy was always there, it's simply not only false, it was unacceptable in the time of Hildebrand. And if it was unacceptable in the time of Hildebrand, it was probably not even, it was not envisionable in the time of any of the fathers of the Western Church, and that includes the Holy Popes. I hate to say this, but when you think of every alleged proof text for papal monarchy that is presented, whether it's from St. Gregory the Great, or it's from Pope St. Hermistus, or anyone, these concepts would have been impossible to them. They would have made no sense to them. And this is something to remember whenever you're dealing with a Roman Catholic apologist, that ultimately it's not real. What they're describing is a reality that was created after Hildebrand, that was not envisionable. You can even point to Pope Nicholas. Pope Nicholas, always, as wrong as he was against St. Photius, he still maintained, the ideas of canonical integrity in a synod, so on and so forth. This is all lost on your average Roman Catholic apologist because he firmly believes in the Hildebrandian model.
I mean, even Nicholas realized he had to create a rubber stamp synod. I mean, that was not correct, but he realized he had to have the veneer, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, but and he's not the first to do it. I mean,
exactly.
Throughout the in the first 1,000 years of Christian history, a lot of people did rubber stamp synods.
Exactly, and obviously Nicholas was right, and he was right to be condemned. St. Photius was perfectly correct in that. But you see how even at that point, remember that St. Photius and the Byzantine emperors wrote a letter to, I think, either the Emperor of Lotharingia or the King of Lotharingia, or one of maybe it was, I can't remember, Emperor Lothar or King Charles the Bald, I can't remember, and saying, look, why don't you just depose Nicholas for us? And they actually marched to Rome to depose Nicholas, and they were going to seize the city, but I think some negotiations happened. And remember also, one of the successors of Nicholas, Hadrian II, there was a letter written to him by the Emperor Charles the Bold and several other of the German bishops, in which they said, look, you have to stop behaving in these ways, or what? We're going to do what the Emperor Justinian did to Vigilius, which is basically arrest him and put him in, maybe nice prison, but put him in prison. And they made the comment that they quoted St. Leo the Great in that letter, saying that the privilege of Peter is given where there is equity. So if there is no equity in the judgment, then the claims for the papal prerogatives, according to the German bishops and French bishops, even in the 50s and 60s, that if the Pope makes an uncanonical judgment or judgment contrary to the canons, it's not given according to equity and it has no force. Now, I remember we'd spoken earlier, I hate to not entirely switch gears, but I'm going to put a link here in the private chat, and you can put it up if you want, Father. But we had mentioned.
I would like to address a question.
Okay, go ahead.
That popped up, and then we'll get to that. And Alexander asks, hold on. Do you mind doing a show on the Cluny Abbey and its influence during the centuries leading up to the Hildebrandian schism? Okay, well, I'm going to continue. It says specifically the extent that Cluniac reforms had an influence on Hildebrand and his papal monarchy ideas. You have the text for that letter from Constantinople to the Frankish court regarding Nicholas. Okay, well, those are two different questions, but I'm going to deal with the Cluny Abbey one first, because of the fact that I do want to establish this right off the bat. That's going back into the stupid estrangement thesis that we don't address, and I'll explain why. Cluny Abbey was founded in 910. So even if we are talking about, let's just imagine, even though we have covered this on shows before, and I'm not calling your idea stupid because it's literally in history books, but it's wrong. And that is that even if we take the founding of Cluny, which was in 910, to the Dictatus Papae, that's less than 200 years. So even if we invent, and this is again wrong, the idea that Cluny had formed, and then all of a sudden, one day the abbot of Cluny's decided, hey, you know what we're going to do? We're going to make a monarchical papacy. Even if that was true, and it's not, because many of the monasteries of the Cluniac reform were actually against Hildebrand. But even if that was true, it was not centuries, and it would not have had real influence in that sense, except that Hildebrand may have touched upon been there. I think he was in one of the Cluniac monasteries for a while, but it would not have affected. I don't think. I wouldn't put blame on Cluny. It doesn't make sense to me, because that implies that there's some. We're always trying to create the golden strain, the thinking to establish a logical conclusion. To the estrangement theory, and ultimately, but it doesn't have one. Hildebrand operated on Hildebrand's own basis. We could imagine a legend of some secret super papist monk that was hiding, that gave Hildebrand, the Dictatus Papae, but it's not real. It's not based on anything. It's based on legend. Hildebrand's own actions speak for themselves, and I don't think. I think we do find writers claiming that it's related to the Cluniac reforms, and I think that's just excuse making. I don't think it bears out to the history.
All I'll say about that is that we have, what is it, Rudolf Glaber? I have it somewhere on a website. I have my Western Orthodox website, who mentions he was a monk of Cluny, and he wrote his chronicle around the year 1000 AD. And he mentions about the attempt of one of the popes to create essentially Stavropygial monasteries in France. Okay, which even in later church history, patriarchs on many occasions even metropolitans were, without the approval of local ruling bishops, were creating Stavropygial monasteries in others' dioceses, which is a controversial issue to begin with, for obvious reasons. To take a monastery under your own authority, if you're the patriarch or metropolitan.
And this still happens now.
Yeah, and so that would be a more widespread, if it's abuse, it's a widespread abuse, not specifically, you can't say, well, that's papism, and and as I recall, I'm looking for it now, what happened was one of the monks of Cluny who wrote this chronicle stated that it was shameful and contrary to the canons and impossible that the pontiff of the apostolic see could have such a power.
This is for a Stavropygial monastery.
Exactly. So their concept even for that is, they didn't even accept that. Now, I have read some secondary sources that what they will say is this, and this may be, this is not the same as the Cluniac estrangement, but you can look at it different ways. What they'll say is that the Cluniac monasteries, as it gets into the late 900s, when they become more powerful, they desired greater conformity to the rule of St. Benedict, especially to the Typicon as developed, or the customary as developed at Cluny. Because remember, Fleury was a competitor to Cluny, because Fleury had the relics of St. Benedict, which they had saved from the Saracens when the Saracens were attacking Monte Cassino. Because remember, Monte Cassino is like below Rome, even.
Yeah.
So as I recall, what's argued sometimes is this. The Cluniac monasteries really were only focused on other monasteries. They weren't really focused on the parochial clergy. All right. So if they came to a monastery and the abbot had a wife, which there are some cases in which that was happening, they would cause a lot of problems there, and that's justifiable. That's not reform.
And
that's
a married abbot's
exactly. Yeah, you can't have that. All right. So, and one of the arguments is that during the reign of Emperor Henry III, one of the problems I think is a real criticism of Henry III. Now, Henry III was the father of Henry IV. He was the one that had to go himself into Rome in 1047, 1048. We covered this to stop this insane multiple elections of 4, 5, 2, 3 different popes fighting among the Roman nobility and all the rest. And he had to basically, I think he had a number of them deposed and supported the election of a German archbishop who became Damasus II. But one of the problems, or one of the possible legitimate criticisms of Henry III is this. He gave up a good deal of his royal prerogative. He never legally gave it up. He just allowed it to be lessened when he put a number of people in episcopal positions in the 1030s and 40s. What I mean by that is this. People would come to him. They'd say, there's been an election in this diocese. And he'd just say, fine, whatever. He just give a rubber stamp. Whereas his actual position should have been, let me examine it. Let me have my advisors examine this person to see if we object to the election or not. Okay. And I've heard people argue that maybe 40, 50 people got appointed in France and Germany who probably were not people that should have been appointed. And this is the reason you have in Germany, even any opposition to Henry showed up in certain dioceses, Henry IV, because these were bishops who were, in some sense, in the late 1040s, because Hildebrand was active even then, were allied to Hildebrand or his proto movement, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Now, however, many of these French and German bishops themselves did not even go many of them were Cluniacs, but a lot of them simply still, even then, sided with Henry IV eventually, because they may have been for reform, whatever. That's an ambiguous term. It means a whole lot of stuff.
Yeah.
They weren't necessarily for the idea of selling off people into slavery and killing Mary priests and, doing this and that. And even though they may have pointed out to, well, Pope so-and-so said, a married man after he becomes priest, his wife should live with him, brother and sister. You may be able to find those instances. But many of them weren't willing to go to the extent of basically deposing many of their own priests or killing them if they couldn't get them to do that. They might just say, please, if you can do this, do it. And if you're not, we're not going to get rid of you. All right? So there is some evidence, I think, to the notion that when the emperors in the 1030s or really in the 1040s began to relent and to listen to people who had ideas of that the emperor should have no role in elections and he should simply just rubber stamp them, that's actually how a lot of the early opponents got in. They were people who claimed and feigned obedience to the old imperial symphonia idea, but they never really had it. All right, and and those groups could be divided between those who were kind of a soft quasi Hildebrandians, or would be in the future that, if you know what I mean, who would side with the emperor eventually, and those who were the more ideological allies and disciples of Hildebrand, because remember he's active even in the 1040s. So, but is that really Cluny? I don't think so. I think you can argue that Cluny gets taken over time because it's a prominent monastery. Always great prominent monasteries can be taken over. Look at what happened in the life of Saint Fulgentius. Saint Fulgentius of Rus. But I recently on one of my channels I've been reading the life of Saint Fulgentius. Wants to go at one point from North Africa to the Egyptian desert in the 520s or like around year 500 for 490s. And one of the bishops has to say, look, no, you can't. You realize there's been a schism and heresy over there, and all the desert monasteries, almost all of them, have become heretical. But he's talking about the Akakian, the Monophysites.
Right.
Right? So does that mean that the monasteries founded by St. Anthony and all these other ones that were holy places 40 years earlier or 100 years earlier, that they were evil then and now they were always evil? No, it just means, heretics can take over monasteries. You can have massive eruptions of heresy and schism and controlling vast areas. Now, whatever explanations you want to give to that, the whole golden chain and this idea leads to that idea or whatever, that's not necessarily how it all works out, though. In the
Yeah,
case of in the case of Egypt, they simply, unfortunately, many of the monks are going to say, well, if the patriarch and the bishops say it, then I believe it. They make a lot of people simply go along with what their patriarch or bishop says, and unfortunately, in history, that can have mixed results. In many cases, it can, oftentimes, if it's orthodox, there's no problem. You don't have to worry. This is why St. John Chrysostom says bishops and metropolitans and patriarchs, the bishops have greater responsibility because a lot of people aren't going to be investigating ideas like they should. That's all I'll say about that.
Well, one thing that I do want to keep, I want to point this out, Alexander, is that ultimately the Patarines at this time were influential, and they probably did influence some of the monastic houses. And so the point is, as we can see from the letter we were reading earlier of Peter Crassus, ultimately Hildebrand did not hold to these monastic ideals. Because they were pushing for a greater respect for the rule of Saint Benedict, and Hildebrand had no respect for the rule to begin with. So the idea that there's some sort of Cluniac influence, it's reversed. What actually happened is Hildebrand influenced Cluny, not the other way around. And that's just basically a function of history, unfortunately, as was mentioned with Monophysitism. So in any case, the other question, do you have the text from the letter from Constantinople to the Frankish court regarding Nicholas? I don't.
I'll have to find it. I remember reading about it. I'll have to find it.
Okay. If there are no other questions right now, let me see what you had sent me. Okay, so you sent me the decree of Pope Leo in 965. Give me just 1 second. I'll put that up on the screen. Hold on. Okay, let me see here. Boom, share. Okay, so we can see as late as 965, and you put this up on your True Western Orthodoxy site. It's on it's truewesternorthodoxy.blogspot, traditionalwesternorthodoxy.blogspot.com.
Yes. Go ahead.
Well, it's your blog, so if you want to read it.
We were discussing this issue, I believe, in the other program.
Okay.
And remember, what was Leo the Ninth's history? I mean, Leo the Eighth's history. Well, they had a council in Rome in 963, where the Italian bishops, there were some German bishops that came along with Emperor Otto the First, I believe it was Otto the First. Okay, and a council was held in Rome, and they deposed John the 12th. He was called Octavian, who was notorious, evil liver. Not an evil liver, like an organ, but a person who lived evil life.
Oh, okay, yeah, I was confused there. About the liver, yeah.
So he was deposed. He died a few days later after he got caught in bed with some husband walked in on him with his wife, and they got in a fight, and he died later. Anyway, but he was already deposed. He didn't recognize the deposition, but he got deposed. So at that point, they elect. I think there was the deacon Leo. He was a Roman cleric, Roman deacon. And technically, according to Ultramontane and Papist, that's the same thing, but Papist idea, his election should have been considered illegal because you can't depose a pope. All right, now they can claim, when John the 12th died, then he kind of became pope by default. But there was still no election. How would you? It's very, very odd. And even in some later papal listings, there's a debate about whether Leo VIII is actually a legitimate pope, although eventually they had to accept it without much discussion. I think maybe they have some kind of epikeia argument or something like that. So one of the things that Leo VIII does, by the time John the 12th is dead, and they have to acknowledge him still at this point as a legitimate, Pope of Rome, is he gives a decree, it's partially translated, giving the emperor the right of what? Investiture. All right? Now, later in the 11th century, this becomes somewhat inconvenient for obvious reasons. And so the Hildebrandians began to try to say, well, it's fraudulent and it's just a fraud made 80 years ago or 90 years ago. But it was a well-known practice. So I'll simply read the 963 decree. It's at the very bottom. I don't really have to read my commentary. You can read it if you want. And you can find this in the source book of medieval history. It says, quote, in the synod held at Rome in the Church of the Holy Savior. This is the synod. Okay, so following the example of Blessed Pope St. Adrian I, who granted to Karl, that's Charlemagne, victorious king of the Franks and Lombards, the dignity of the patriciate and the right to ordain the Pope and to invest bishops. By ordain, by the way, they don't mean lay hands on, they mean to participate in election. Oftentimes ordination or ordain in that sense can
assignment.
can have different connotations. We, Leo, bishop, servant of the servants of God, with all the clergy and people of Rome, by our apostolic authority, bestow upon Lord Otto I, king of the Germans, and upon his successors in the kingdom of Italy forever, the right of choosing the successor to the Pope, and of ordaining the Pope and the archbishops and bishops, so that they shall receive their investiture and consecration from him, with the exception of those prelates whose investiture and consecration the emperor has conceded to the Pope or the archbishops. No one, no matter what his dignity or ecclesiastical rank, shall have the authority to choose the patricius or to ordain the Pope or any bishop without the consent of the emperor, and that without bribery. And the emperor shall be by right both king of Italy and patricius of Rome. But if anyone has been chosen bishop by the clergy and people, he shall not be consecrated unless he has been approved by the aforesaid king and has received his investiture from him. End quote. So that pretty much overthrows the whole concept behind the Hildebrandian investiture controversy.
Yeah,
So
ultimately,
the only way to dispel that is either to simply attack Leo VIII as an anti-pope, to declare him a heretic, or to simply, claim it's a forgery. All of which failed. There's no way you can claim those things.
So right here, I mean, we just look at the date, 963. The entire estrangement thesis that the monarchy of the Pope was somehow this thing that was developing, it's not real. It's just not real. I mean, this is 90 years before 1054. There's no concept. If you establish that the Western people, as we established at the beginning of the show for the first hour, and you look at this decree in 963, the concept of papal monarchy was literally invented by Hildebrand and his co-religionists.
Now, notice Leo VIII also says that Pope St. Adrian had granted Charlemagne in around the 799 or around that period the dignity of the patriciate and the right to participate or to approve the election of the Pope and to invest bishops. So Leo VIII is actually not even inventing this. He's going back to a decision made 150 years ago, which itself, I believe, was simply a confirmation of previous custom.
Well, example, that was confirmation of what was originally done by the Byzantine emperor.
Yes, so, exactly. That was just a transfer between who's going to be the legitimate emperor in Rome. That's all that matters. That's all that's
exactly.
And in fact, on my shelf somewhere, I can't find it. I have it right here. Maybe we could talk about it in a different program if we ever want to do more.
Yeah, definitely.
There's a book I have called The Formularies of Angers and Markolf, two Merovingian legal handbooks, and it's printed by the Liverpool University, the translated text for historians. And as I recall, it's about 200 or 300 pages. I'm not going to go through all of it now, but you have formularies going back to the 500s, where Merovingian kings, different kings back in the 500s, were having to give mandates for the consecration of bishops in conjunction with the elections by the clergy and people. Now, by election, they don't mean a popular assembly. That's technically prohibited. To determine an election only by popular assembly is prohibited by the Canons, I think Laodicea. By election, they meant they were, for example, cardinal clergy. They didn't just have a majority vote. You had to have some sort of consensus. They were important laity that had to discuss. It was kind of a consensus agreement. And then the king had to come in on the matter. All right. And if that happens, then the king issues a mandate. The election is approved and the king's consent is given. And then there's the custom of that happened in many places. Unless the emperor or the king conceded it, it was the right of the consecrated monarch to give the pastoral staff in the pontifical ring to the bishop at his own consecration.
Okay, I will say Alexander's got some great questions right now, and this is a great question because, wow, it puts everything in history into context. I'm just going to put the first part because the second part, we have a whole different answer for that. But the question is, out of curiosity, what if the emperor is a heretic? Who appoints the patriarch then? Well, it's still the emperor, because that's led to some of the biggest Christological controversies in history. I mean, emperors appointing heretics when they're heretics has happened a lot. As
If the
bad as
emperor is, if the emperor is a schismatic heretic and he appoints a heretic, then that patriarch's a heretic. You have no right. You don't have to obey him. You have the obligation not to obey him. For example, when Leo the Isaurian, I believe, expelled Saint Germanus from Constantinople in the late 720s, and he appointed, who was it, the iconoclast Paul or something like that. I can't remember the iconoclast he appointed as patriarch. Well, that patriarch's he's an invalid patriarch. So it's just as clear that if the emperor's a heretic, then his appointments are not valid. However, that does not necessarily mean you need to engage in civil war to overthrow the emperor.
Right.
Especially okay, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Because remember, even in the 740s and 50s, even in Francia or Gaul under the Franks, for a long time, even though they like Rome, they regarded the emperors in Constantinople as iconoclast heretics, they would still send them letters as emperors of the Romans, and they would recognize them as brother emperor or brother king or something like that. Brother emperor. So no one seriously challenged, wanted to. For example, there's somewhere in the 8th century Liber Pontificalis where one of the popes, who came after Pope Zacharias, there was a riot. There were numerous riots in Rome, in which, remember, the Byzantine emperor still technically controlled Rome, and they were trying to. However, the Byzantine representatives would say, "Look, you got to remove all these icons and go into communion with the the heretic guy in Constantinople." And the Pope simply said, "We're not going to do it." And it became problematic after a certain period of time. And so at one point, there was a crowd who demanded one of the popes in the late 750s declare the emperor in Constantinople to be not deposed, just say, we don't recognize him. I don't know if they said deposed, but we're just not going to recognize him. And the Pope actually said, no, we shouldn't do this. We have to preserve as much as possible, as much as can be in us, the Roman Commonwealth. He used the word res publica, which didn't contradict the concept of having an emperor. So there was great resistance to even doing that in Rome and even in France and other parts of Italy. So, I mean, it caused problems, especially as the fact that you have Byzantine emperors sending out their forces to kill Orthodox people. And I'm surprised there wasn't some massive general insurrection throughout the Byzantine Empire and Italy and other parts of their control to begin with. I mean, people used massive restraint to avoid a civil war. And in many cases, they were simply large-scale domestic disobedience by civil authorities to carrying out mass executions. For example, Cyprus was never left the empire, but the elite rulership in Cyprus always maintained orthodoxy, repudiated communion with the heretical iconoclasts, but never repudiated the emperor. They were de facto independent, but they would still assist in certain military campaigns. So people always found a way to avoid what Hildebrand tried to do, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, and that's exactly what we want to once again reiterate, that this is innovative. It is something that is now the reason I separated the second part, which is pushing heretical ideas like the filioque, is because that's a whole other question about how much textual verification there is for the filioque being in the West before the schism. A lot of the insertions are now we can see they're of later centuries. It's a whole different question, but ultimately the emperor guarded the unity of the people. So in a sense, like we find in the life of Saint Martin, this same exact issue comes up with monothelitism. So the point is that even if the emperor is a heretic, he's still the emperor. So they, the whole goal was that maybe the next emperor won't be a heretic, or maybe the emperor could be converted back.
If you owe reverence to the pagan Roman emperor, you owe reverence to even an emperor who becomes a monothelite. You don't obey him when he tells you to do sin. You don't obey anybody when they tell you to do sin, and heresy is a sin. That there's no obedience to disobedience to God is not obedience to God. All right.
Okay. Now I want to, because I see Craig is in the chat, and so we had actually we kind of addressed basically. I think this whole episode addresses it. The idea that 90% of the papacy was there, and then the other 10% was what was that issue. I mean, I don't know if you want to, if we can bring him on for a couple of minutes, because I think he should have a right to defend himself.
I mean, I think you know more about the issue. I'll let you bring him on, and I'm going to go because I have to go to church.
Okay.
So, and you can discuss the matters and such.
Hold on. Let me. Okay, that's fine. Give me just a moment, and I'll get that information. Hold on. I'm gonna just invite him on if he wants to come on. If not, we're gonna. I mean, we can end the show. We've been almost at 2 hours here. So hold on one moment, and then either way, if he wants to come on, that'd be great, because it's a valid question ultimately, and it's unfortunately due to, I hate to say this, but it's due to reliance on secondary sources. And so the point is,
and remember, avoid quote mining, because you can always pull out quotes to defend the Dictatus Papae or distort quotes. You have to find the historical context. Like I explained the case of Dictatus Papae claiming that the papacy has the right to depose a king. Well, that's based upon the whole issue that happened in 750, which was not an open deposition. It was a series of backroom deals, if at best, which is okay. It's not the same. So
hold on, I see that Craig is popping on here. So just for
quotes to defend the Dictatus Papae or distort.
Oh no, Craig, you want to shut off the? We're hearing ourselves. We're
Well, I'm going to say hello and goodbye to Craig. Christ has risen, and I'll let you two discuss this. I have to go.
Well, I got
everything is God-pleasing and productive. Okay, all right.
No problem. Okay, Benedicite Vladika. And I'll talk to Craig for a few, because we're gonna probably close up in about 10 minutes anyway. But yeah. So Craig, can you hear me?
I can hear you. I didn't know it was going to be brought on, so I'm totally not prepared, but that's fine.
No, it's cool. And what we spent most of the episode discussing was the concept of papal monarchy and how foreign it was. Because if you look at the text of Peter Crassus, which we cover for basically the first hour of the show, basically, hold on one second, Vladika, just saying Christ is risen, and I'm just going to quickly say, truly is risen, Benedicite. But in any case, let me spell that right. So basically, the idea that the papal monarchy, etc., first off, when you say 90% of the papacy could be found, I'm still confused as to what you meant by that. So, and I think a lot of people found it controversial. So you're here, so you can explain.
Yeah, there's two things where I come at this, which I guess in this format, it's easier to be a little more nuanced. And I apologize for the baby in the background.
No problem.
For one thing it's just like an off the cuff remark to say there's bishops of Rome making claims. And I like putting it that way because it's, I think, apologetically useful to meet people halfway. So that is something that I do that I guess works for me and makes it easy for me to speak to people. It also makes it easier for me to rationalize certain things from history, such as like when Saint Cyprian was opposing Pope Saint Stephen, saying that there's no bishop of bishops and each bishop is accountable himself before God, and he's not under compulsion under another bishop. And we have to remember Pope St. Stephen is a saint because of his martyrdom. It's definitely not because of his baptismal theology, nor his ecclesiology. While St. Cyprian is a saint specifically because of his ecclesiology. Right? Treatise 1 is on the Catholic Church. Everyone loves quoting it. And for his baptismal theology. So Cyprian's a saint other than his martyrdoms, also because he was a great theologian. From the little we could piece together from Pope St. Stephen, he does not seem to be an impressive theologian, be a nice way to put it. So I think that's one part of the 90%, 10% thing. Let me say this one other statement, and then I want to just admit to my own ignorance. when I was bike riding today, you know, thinking in my head about the whole idea of consent. And if the 10% that's missing is consent, that's a massive 10%. And it's a matter of perspective. You could think that's the 90%, and the 10% is just the papal claims and the prerogatives that are asserted but not seriously adhered to, because they're always consenting to the Orthodox ecclesiology. So, like, for example, at every major council, there is, in the Latin manuscripts, we have indications of these papal prerogatives being asserted. In the Greek manuscripts, we don't. And though I know there could be claims of corruption in manuscripts, I think some of these are actually considered older than the first millennium. So we do know that in diplomacy going into these councils, the Latins would make one claim for their in-house audience, and then to the Greeks, they would have to see what would be consented to diplomatically. And so I think the issue of consent is gigantic because it's Christological. It comes from 1 Corinthians 11:3. It's an Apostolic Canon 34. Ubi did, I don't know if he talked about his video, but his rebuttal of Eric Ybarra was excellent. It was a great.
Oh, it was a really great premiere. I was big on it. It was awesome.
It was great. And so you see there how he says, look, he calls himself, you know, metropolitan archbishop of the churches, and, you know, ecumenical patriarch was originally a title for, you know, the Pope of Rome. But he says, but look what these titles meant within the context. And it's obviously mirroring Apostolic Canon 34. So that issue of consent is gigantic. And so when Vatican I says you do not require consent, that's Christologically heretical. It's ecclesiologically heretical. And when I brought this up in my closing statement in my final debate with Eric Ybarra on the topic of schism, there was never a reply to this. And whenever I brought that up, listen, this is Christologically heretical. You cannot have a system without consent.
Well, I think it's an excellent point, Craig, and I really suggest you watch the first half of the show, only because of the fact that I would say that concept was well known even in the West, and so we brought the text of Peter Crassus to King Henry the Fourth. And basically what it talks about is how basically the entire system that Hildebrand was trying to bring into existence through the Dictatus Papae, etc. He doesn't specifically name the Dictatus Papae because those are prerogatives that Hildebrand uses throughout his anti-pontificate. But the whole point is that it was unheard of. And he refers to St. Gregory. He refers to, you know, the idea that the Pope could operate without the consent of the emperor, or more importantly, that the Pope could even claim to appoint the emperor. These are alien ideas to them. Like, and, you know, so we go through that. It's not us, it's Peter Crassus. But the point is, up until the Dictatus Papae, the concept of the popes claiming some sort of monarchy was foreign to them. It just made no sense. And so this is one of the things that we kind of have to establish, because when you're talking with Roman Catholic apologists, they often take papal monarchy as a priori, and that needs to be kind of dismantled a little bit because historically it's not real. And so that's one of the things that we try to cover, and what we've been trying to cover with all this discussion of the quote-unquote investiture controversy, is that we want to make absolutely clear that this was foreign in the West. It wasn't like East versus West. In the West, it was foreign. Alexander, who asked a question about the influence of Cluny, there wasn't even really an influence of Cluny, because even Cluny, many of the Cluniac monasteries did not support what Hildebrand was doing. Some did, and that could have been through the influence of the Patarines. But the point is that you can find a lot of evidence that basically the creation of the papal monarchy concept was right there in the 11th century, and there was hardened opposition in the West to it, to the point where they elected a whole new pope, and that basically became the investiture controversy. So, in that sense, the consent of the emperor, whether it was from Byzantium or transferred to the Western emperor, always remained. The consent of the people. The Orthodox people was always there in East and West. I don't know if that makes sense.
That's why Ubi, in his video, and I can't comment on this one yet because I didn't watch it. I came in from a bike ride.
Yeah.
But
No problem.
but that's why Ubi made a great point where this idea where like, oh well, technically they could have councils and they could be advisors and this and that, but within the papal system, he could automatically depose everyone who's there, appoint new bishops. That's obviously
guess where that came from.
I mean, we can't see that. Yeah, no, that does not exist in the first millennium. That's totally foreign.
Yeah, not only in East and West, but literally what you just pointed out are two dictates in the Dictatus Papae of 1075.
Now, let me ask you this, because you know more about the medieval West by far than I do, and which would be this. Are the issue with Hinchmar, it's in the 9th century, and he speaks of the reception of councils specifically. The word in Latin, I think, is receptisma or something like that. Mm-hmm. And so I can't remember the actual, like usually, when they make statements and write these things, it's usually in response to some sort of controversy. I can't remember what it was in the 9th century. I know that Frankish power was waning at that point by the mid and late 9th century. And I think Hinchmar was in France, but could you take over on that? Do you know that?
Well, I mean, I wish Bishop Enoch was here because he would be better at this on this particular subject. But we did discuss that in the 9th century, there were questions of basically the papacy establishing Stavropegial monasteries, which is something that's still controversial even today. But it was not. There was no grandiose claims past that, so it was really more of a claim of something that the Pope shouldn't have been doing, but unfortunately a lot of people shouldn't have been doing and shouldn't be doing and are still doing. So these are, in other words, it divorced from its actual context. It looks like it could be a claim that's higher than it is. But in terms of the reception of councils, this is something that was already well known. We actually, we discussed this in the first part with Peter Crassus, because he actually he references not just St. Gregory, but he also references the councils of Chalcedon and Carthage in condemning Hildebrand. So the point is, there was clearly a well established civil and ecclesiastical legal procedure. It was not something that was invented later. Like it was often you read in a lot of these secondary sources that basically Gratian's collections, etc., became the beginning of canon law. This is absolutely false. The ecclesiastical and civil law were both very well established. So councils that were received were immediately enshrined into law.
Well, and let me comment on that. And to answer my own question, I think the issue was particularly Nicaea too, which had delayed reception in France. But that aside, I was literally, the reason I even found out this show was happening early today, I was on Facebook and I was talking to Subdeacon Daniel Kakish. People are aware he's an Oriental Orthodox subdeacon. And I was speaking to him specifically about the Canons of Constantinople I and when they were received by the Oriental Orthodox. And he was speaking of how in 475, they officially received the Canons of Constantinople I, excluding Canon 3, allegedly. There's debate about this. I forget which council, but in the order of seating at a council would reflect the precedence of the patriarch that was present. So, for example, when you read them into councils, they always will name the legates of Rome first, then it'll be the Bishop of Constantinople, who's usually present because all the councils are usually within earshot of, Constantinople, and, and then you get Alexandria, et cetera, et cetera. Other than Chalcedon, when Juvenal, for example, was kind of still under trial. Somewhat a misnomer. He wasn't outright under trial, but let's just roll with this for a moment. So anyhow, there was a council in the late 4th century which had Constantinople, Antioch, and Alexandria there, and in their order of seating, Constantinople was first, which implies that there was the reception of Canon 3, because remember, that's before any schisms after Chalcedon. So they would have, at that point, that canon was not controversial. Now, why am I bringing this up? It's because Canon 5 of Constantinople I is somewhat debated because in all the Latin manuscripts, it's missing. Now, which is interesting because Canon 3 isn't. That includes manuscripts from the 5th century. So Canon 3 was always accepted by the West. We see this in Chalcedon. They refer to it several times in session 1. Eusebius of Dorleum mentions it in session 16. He said he read it to Pope Leo himself, and Leo accepted it. So there seems to be very little controversy that Constantinople I and its canons were received throughout the church. But here's the interesting part. The only part that's really under debate, it's not even Canon 3, it's Canon 5, because it's found only in the Greek collections, according to the secondary sources that we have access to, but it's because people aren't cross-disciplinary. They don't understand, yes, there's Arminian and there's Coptic and there's, our, Miaphysites and their collections of canons. And they have Canon 5, Constantinople I, which shows that it dropped off in the Latin canons. I have my theories, we don't have to talk about them now. But it shows if they even had this canon in the 5th century, it means everyone had these canons, everyone received this council. It was not a matter of you had to wait for, Pope Leo or whatever Pope to ratify it, to make, the canon to be received. It already was received. And so I think this is something that's missed out a lot, and there's a lot of misinformation due to, I think, bad secondary sources and a lack of critical reading of the fathers themselves, because St. Augustine takes for granted Canon 5 of Constantinople I. He cites it against the Donatists.
Now it's interesting because I'm trying to look here at, and I'm looking here at the First Council of Constantinople. And so what I'm seeing here, it says here that I guess the 4th canon was, the 5th canon was actually passed the next year, and it is in regard to a tome of the Western bishop, perhaps that of Pope Damasus I. I mean, I've never heard that the 5th canon was actually accepted in the West. It may not have been accepted in that particular session or council reading, but it was still maintained as part of the Roman legal corpus. I don't really, I understand why the Monophysites or Miaphysites, whatever you want to call them, would quibble over that, and that's because of the fact that that would have to do with the recognition of the Byzantine Empire, which at the same time this was beginning to occur, with the Monophysite controversy, whatever you want to refer to it. There was also the added issue of whether they were going to recognize the empire itself. So this is something that it's important, but I don't know that there was this real controversy about the 5th canon. I think it was accepted throughout the West and the East, perhaps not in the exact same canonical collections, but it was present in both of them.
Well, yeah, because we know, because like what you were referring to, I guess, was kind of leapfrog my mind to this direction, was that you don't need to find, let's say, Gracian's collection or something. Oh, that's where all the canon law came from. It was always in the background. Every important church had this. It's just what collections have made it down to us today. And for whatever reason in the West, they all don't ascribe Canon 5 to Constantinople I. My theory specifically is I think they didn't know how to treat it due to it not being fully, they didn't know how to use it against the Donatists, is my opinion. And I think because Augustine uses it selectively against the Donatists, but there's parts of that canon, for example, because it allows the rebaptizing of Gnostics and Christological heretics, but Augustine did not believe in that, as did several other Latin fathers. So I don't think they knew how to deal with that canon for the sort of, I think apologetic would be anachronistic, but for the sort of schismatics and stuff they're dealing with, that canon could have went both ways. Both sides could have saw what they wanted, while I think on our side, it's more consistent with how our tradition has applied that issue. Though again, between my jurisdiction that I was chrismated in, which is OCA, and let's say the typical, I believe all calendarists like Rocor, they rebaptize. So there's, and it doesn't matter, you could be Roman Catholic. So it speaks to how that canon has been flexibly applied. And I think Basil talks about it when he speaks about the canon. So it's the East really doesn't have a problem with that. I think the West, because they've always had this sort of tendency to accept any baptism whatsoever, no matter how heretical, that's a problem. That's exactly the problem Cyprian was fighting against.
Well, I think that, again, now I don't, depending on, whether you're referring to Rocor or the old calendarist, the forms of reception do vary. But in general, baptism is usually applied to people who are clearly heterodox. Now that's something that really was more stringent. That was really closer to the Greek practice, which is still done in Greece to some degree, even though it's actually prohibited in the U.S. Among what were SCOBA jurisdictions. I don't even know what. There's a new term now. And so basically, when we talk about that particular canon, it is very important, but I think it's been applied unevenly over the centuries, and I think that that's just a function of history. I think that when baptisms start getting really, really weird, there's baptisms in churches now where people just jump into a pool. I heard of one where a guy jumped into a pool and his pastor said, "Dive for the Lord." That's not a baptism. I mean, sure, he was immersed, but it was closer to a bath. I hate to say that, but
no, I agree. It's I just want to qualify this because my comments are sort of to even be put aside from the sort of presentation you guys just gave, carefully look at the history. Can't do justice to what the show I could tell was, because when I came on, I saw historical sources being shared screen, and that is, I'm just a guy who's learning. I'm pretty new at this, and so if my statements aren't nuanced enough or even aren't accurate enough, I'm still trying to grapple with myself, even the Roman Catholic and Orthodox ecclesiology, more practically. Right? It's one thing to kind of read about this in books. It's another to see how it works. Mechanistically, mechanically.
Yeah,
I have not read the Rudder, and actually, I've been told by a monk friend of mine he doesn't want me reading it. So it's
I think that's your monk friend is wrong. If you're going to defend Orthodox, you need to know the Rudder.
I guess he thinks that it's something that really priest and bishop should be reading. What was his opinion? But
priests and bishops use it. The rest of us read it.
Well, I guess my point in bringing this up is not to say whether he's right or wrong or defend his opinion. It's to point at my own ignorance, right? So I'm open to being corrected on these issues. My job is a lot easier. Like we talked about this, my job's a lot easier if everything about the papacy is completely anachronistic, and obviously so, right? Yeah. It's way easier. I have no motive to be like, because there's people that want to see the papacy. You know what I mean? They want
to. Believe it or not, Craig, that's actually more common than you think. A lot of the things that hold people to the papacy are largely psychological. They want a papacy more than a papacy has a justification historically. But I cannot recommend enough to, again, I recommend everyone should read the Rudder. I mean, my wife has a copy. It's it's the point is that it's not an inaccessible text. Peter Crassus, who was a lawyer, was clearly referring to the canons of the church. And I should be clear, Craig, if you're quoting from the canons of the councils, you're already quoting from the Rudder. It's just a collection of the councils.
No, I understand. It's a lot more of them, but
no. It's just the councils that are accepted in Orthodoxy. It's the 7 councils, the first, second synod, and then it has the canons that were accepted by Carthage, like the canons of Saint John the Faster. That's all it is. There's everything else in the Rudder is just commentary from Saint Nicodemus on the canons. That's literally the whole thing.
Maybe that's what he didn't want me reading, because I've read all those canons.
Yeah, so you've already read the Rudder.
Well, it didn't say Rudder on the front. I read all the councils.
No. And if you read the councils of the ecumenical councils, the 7 councils that they have in the Erdman series, that's basically 90% of the Rudder.
Well, it's on a slightly different note. My question for you, Ephesus 1, Father Price's collection on Ephesus 1. Is out, I think, this weekend or next weekend. I pre-ordered it. Are you online, like on the queue to get it? It's $175.
If there's one thing I like focusing on the show, Craig, it's focus on the stuff that's free. Because
there's enough free.
I don't have 100. yeah, there's enough free stuff to keep you occupied for a lifetime. I just cannot afford $175. Hopefully, somebody makes a PDF of it. But I think it's I'm not against people being compensated for their work. I just think that when we're talking about the ecumenical councils of the church, that's the property of the church, and I don't know that I feel good paying that much money for a book translating it. I it's just, that's my personal view. But definitely, if you can afford it, I'd say go for it. But
it's just I want to get my hands on that, because then I would have read everything I could get my hands on when it comes to this.
Ironically, I'm pretty sure you've read most of the Rudder, not realizing you read most of the Rudder.
Probably. I haven't read his commentary. That's I think the largest part of it, though.
Well, a lot of it, I would suggest, because the problem is the published text actually includes commentary that Apostolus Macracus, who had a bunch of wacky ideas on his own, commented on top of St. Nicodemus. So there is actually a version online, which is the Master John edition, where he takes out all of Macracus's stuff, and it becomes a much thinner book.
Oh, okay. I mean, yeah, because it's a massive book. Before that, but I think it is important on this note that, like, if you want to understand the papacy, because that is the topic of the show you just did, and then you want to get to the 11th century as you did in the show and realize they're totally concerned about different stuff and doing different things. It's so important to read the councils, to read the boring minutes, because you look past the order in which they're seated and you won't think much of it, and you will look past.
I don't consider those minutes boring. I consider them essential.
It's it could get pretty tedious, especially with you have to read when they sign, because sometimes in the Fifth Council they sign and it's all exactly the same generally, but like in Chalcedon, their signatures, they have little tidbits, and you got to pick through the tidbits. Yeah. You're trying to piece together a world that you don't live in. That's 1,600 years ago.
Yeah,
and so that's why you'll notice that in secondary sources and apologists that employ secondary sources, and they haven't done the dirty work of actually reading these things word for word, they have so much misinformation. It's not funny. Some of the answers of their questions are in plain sight in these documents.
Yeah, I agree.
And so at least not everyone listening to this show or, listen to me or whatever is going to be able to read all these things, but at least listen to someone who has.
Yeah. Oh, I agree. I 100% agree. And that's exactly why we are focused on the historical sources. And I think once you take a look at the historical sources of the 11th century during the schism, Roman Catholicism was invented then. It was not synthesized over centuries or anything like that.
Roman Catholicism is a sort of chameleon, would be a negative connotation. A seed that grew into this mighty tree would be the way the Roman Catholics would want to view it. The fact that it's and the route that it takes is different, and you could read into things as evolving over time. You really can't grapple with the idea, because what is the idea, right? Like, what is the threshold for the Roman Catholic to believe, yep, this is the papacy? Pretty much anything. Because, right, all it needs is enough time for the seed to grow into whatever. And it's what you see and I knew this before I was Orthodox, what you see in the ancient church is the Orthodox Church in action. You don't need any evolution for you to see that. For Roman Catholicism, you need a different paradigm of thought to even make sense of what they think now and what they see then.
Absolutely. And this is exactly why I definitely recommend the first half of the show, because even in the 11th century, when you're reading Peter Crassus, he sounds like a typical Orthodox Christian, and yet he's an Italian lawyer who's making an argument for King Henry IV about the heresy of Hildebrand. And so the whole point is that concept of orthodoxy in the West remained until the 11th century and had to be physically killed off. I mean, as Bishop Enoch pointed out on the show, and I didn't even know this, that in France there were actually sections where the wives of the clergy were literally just enslaved. They were just separated from their husbands. If their husbands disagreed, they were imprisoned or killed, and they were enslaved. They just took the clergy wives and kids and enslaved them. So the whole point is, that's how stark that 11th century change is. That even the celibacy thing, it didn't exist then. It just was literally imposed over a period of decades. Terrifying stuff. But that's the invention of the Roman Catholic Church.
Well, on that note, then, everyone who's listening to this now, if they just got on now, should rewind to the beginning and listen to that, because that's what we're going to do when this show's over.
All right. Well, in that case, on that note, Craig, thank you for being on. And to everyone who is listening and who is listening, thank you again. Again, up until Ascension Day on Thursday, Christ is risen. And so that's all I've got to say about that.
Indeed, he's risen. God bless you all, audience.
All right. Take care, everyone. And thank you for listening. Have a good day.